So there has been a lot of buzz around cloud computer use, and there have been companies showing up lately, a lot of them from my batch NYC, who have been building their own computer use assistants. So I just wanted to walk you guys through on how Claude computer use works. And basically, if you look at Claude computer use, we go to images. Um, so this is what Cloud Computer Use looks like. So if I open it in a new tab, what you have is on the left side, you have this chat window through which you can send commands to Claude. And on the right side, you have this Ubuntu virtual machine where the Claude agent lives. And so if you look at the code base, you will see there is a function called setup state. And what this function does is it uses Streamlit session state to store a bunch of things. So all the chat message conversations get stored in Streamlit session state.messages. Your Anthropic API key gets stored in session state API key. Which provider are you using? So if you are using Anthropic, then the provider is set to Anthropic. If you're using Google Vertex, then this would be Vertex. And if you use Bedrock, this would be Bedrock. Now, why is this important? It is important because you will see later in the code that they do something called prompt caching. And prompt caching right now is only available on Anthropic. And then you have a bunch of other stuff like the response, the kind of tools that are available to the agent. And there are only a couple of tools available here. If you look at, you have a computer tool, which basically takes the screenshot, then figures out the coordinates in which to click or type. Yeah, and then you have like how many images do you want to send with every chat message. You can, here it's set to 3, and because of prompt caching, it will not cost you a lot of money even if you use 3 images for each chat message. Or if it's a multi-turn chat, then it doesn't cost you a lot. You can change the system prompt, and that will change the behavior of the agent. You can hide the images from the chat if you want to. And sampling loop is basically the loop that gives the agent its behavior. So what happens is that the agent will make a LLM call. It will take a screenshot, send it to Claude, and then it will verify whether or not the task that it was asked by the user to finish has been completed. And as long as that has not been completed, the variable in sampling loop will stay true. There is another use case for sampling loop, which is, let's say the agent was already performing some operation, and in between you send another message. So in that case, we are going to use sampling loop to terminate the current operation and tell Claude that for these specific tools, the operation was terminated, right? You will see that more in action later. You have this main loop where you call the setup state, which I already showed you. Then you have this Streamlit markdown, which basically, let me see if I can zoom in. It's not the best way to zoom in, is it? Let me see if I can change the font size. Well, font size increase, font size increase. Well, sorry about that. Okay, so then it's saying with the sidebar, if the reset button was clicked, you want to reset it, and so on and so forth. These are not important. This is number input. How many images do you want? You can skip all of this. This is auth validated, whether or not we have the API key for Anthropic. I think that is what it is. Session state provider if it's Anthropic, and then the API key, and then we check whether or not we have the API key for authentication. Not that important, honestly. Not for understanding how computer use works. And now what we do is we wait for a new message from the user. And once we have a message from the user, then for every message in session state, we are going to check if it's a string, if message.content is a string, if it is, then we render that. If it is a list, which means that we have multiple message in the content block, then for every block we are going to, well, if it so basically if you look at Anthropic and how messages are sent, the response might sometimes contain a tool result. So, well, if it is a tool result, then we basically render that. If it is a user or an assistant message, we render that. And so all of this gets rendered onto the left side where you have chat. Now, what else do we have? And we have this track sampling loop where we actually call the sampling loop, and basically what that means is that we will pass all of these messages that we received from the front end and the messages that we received from Claude, and they all get sent to sampling loop. The model, the provider, whether it's Anthropic, Google, or Bedrock, the messages which are stored, if you remember, in Streamlit session message. The output callback is what to do once you have an output. And basically what we are saying is if it's a bot output, then we set one of the parameters of the function to sender.bot. That's what partials are for. And we pass in this render message. So anytime there is an output, render message will be called, and the last parameter would be set to bot by default. And this basically allows us, if you use partial, then you don't have to create a Lambda function with a set parameter, right? So yeah. What happens when you have an output? What happens when you have a tool output? So you use partial tool output callback, which is a function that can render the tool output. And again, tool state is set as tool Streamlit session state tools by default. Again, how do you render the API response? So you will use API response callback to render the API response. API key, it was stored here, and how many images. Now, what we should do at this point is we should look at sampling loop, which is defined in the file loop.py. And this is important because what you will see now is that we gather all these tools in a variable called tool collection, which we are going to send to Claude, so Claude knows which tools it has access to. Be the text block param is basically the format in which you are going to be sending the system prompt to Claude. And we are saying that, okay, by default, prompt caching is disabled. We only enable it if the API provider is Anthropic, in which case we enable it. Right. And here you have a couple of functionalities to truncate the amount of response. I think it should be response. If the response size increases. And here we have this raw response, and we are using raw response because we want to render the HTTP response that comes back from Claude. You could completely avoid this by using client messages create in your own use case, but in this case we want to render the API response, and that's why we want the raw response to be received. So here basically you handle the errors and then you render it on your chat window. And if you remember, this is a function that has been defined in streamlit.py file. This was passed as a callback to this function. You do the same thing with tool result, for example. You render that over here. And of course, if you have a tool, then you are going to call that tool. You're going to take that result and append it to your messages. So tool result content. So basically, if you call the tool, then you have to take the result of that tool. You are going to put it inside of this variable called tool result content, and then that will get appended to messages, right? This is, by the way, the standard defined in your Anthropic documentation. So you can go there and check why it's done in the following manner. And yeah, and basically you do all of that. Let's see. Yeah. And you will return it at some point in time. These messages will be returned and stored in st session state messages. um, and yeah, that's basically the entire thing. You have things like add interruption blocks, and this happens if you have a new message while the sampling is still going on, and in that case we have to stop the sampling. We have to stop the agent from doing what it is doing, and then we have to mark these tool calls or these messages as stale, and that's where you use the interruption blocks. And that is why it's called maybe add interruption blocks, because you may or may not want to add these interruption blocks. And if you look at what we do here is we basically take every single tool that we have used previously, and we only do it if it is already in sampling. So if the agent was already in the loop, then we run this. If the agent was not in loop, then we don't do anything and we just return an empty message, an empty list of messages. Now, if it is in sampling, then we are going to take all the tools that it had previously used, and we are going to mark them as interrupted, so they are not used again. That's pretty much what you want to know in Claude computer use. There is not much to it. It's actually very simple if you understand it. So yeah, I'm going to leave it for you guys, and if you like what you saw, then be sure to go to GitHub, give me a thumbs up, give me a star on one of my repositories. Thankful for that. And if you like the content, and if you like to learn more about computer use or tool use or any of that stuff, like agentic stuff in general, feel free to comment down below. Have a great day. Thanks.